Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. My name is Michael Sadowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Circulate Initiative, and I will be your host for today's webinar entitled Aligning and Catalyzing Financial Flows to Meet Needs-Based Financing. This is the third of four webinars that the Financing Coordination Group will host on financing considerations for the Global Plastics Treaty, and we are very happy that you have joined us today. Next slide, please. So in terms of our agenda, we will spend some time with opening remarks to reflect on discussions so far on the financing needs for the Global Plastics Treaty. We'll have a brief recap of the first two webinars, which, by the way, are recorded, so you can find those on our website. And we'll hear from Christian on that. We will have a recap of the ad hoc intersessional open-ended expert group 1 meeting. I know that's a lot. And we'll have a great panel discussion to round out the webinar, followed by Q&A. And then we'll share some closing remarks and next steps. So that's our agenda for today. Some housekeeping items. Everyone is muted on this webinar. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A chat box. You should see that on the bottom right. We will do our best to answer them as we go through, and then we will hold some for the Q&A session at the end. We will record this webinar, and a summary report will be shared with all participants following the event. And then I've included the email address for my colleague Umesh down below if you have additional questions or comments about the webinar. Great. So again, Michael Sadowski, I'll be your host today. I'll just say a few things and then get on with the event. So the Circulate Initiative is a nonprofit working to solve the ocean plastic pollution challenge and build circular and equitable economies across emerging markets. We're thrilled to be part of the Financing Coordination Working Group. Other members of this group include the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum, and you'll hear from some of those groups today. So the goals of the FCG, the Financing Coordination Group, are to improve the overall understanding of the financing landscape for tackling plastic pollution and ultimately catalyzing the capital that we need to address plastic pollution. We've had two webinars so far, and as you know, if you've joined those or if you're following this space, we need a considerable amount of financial resources to address this challenge. By one estimate, up to $1 trillion per year between 2024 and 2040. So it's a huge number. And we know that it's a huge number, and this money isn't necessarily going to where we need it to go. So most of this money right now is going towards downstream solutions, things like recovery and recycling, where we know that more of that money needs to go to actually turn off the tap and reduce pollution. We also know that regionally, it's not going to the countries that need it most. So only 6% of total investment based on our analysis is going to emerging economies where the plastic pollution is most acute. So we know that we need a lot. We know that the money is not flowing to where we need it to go just yet. But I'm excited to kick off this webinar and kind of dig into some of these topics. And so, the purpose of this webinar is to really improve our understanding of this topic, in particular, redirecting risk, reward, and impact to support the unique financial needs of different countries, considering that different countries have varying capacities and roles in the plastics economy. And then also, how do we leverage public and private finance to create synergies and amplify the catalytic impact for greater impact to address this challenge? So we've got a fantastic lineup. You'll hear from me sparingly throughout the webinar, but I'll kind of come back in to introduce folks. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker, Kate Lynch, who's title Head of Division, Circular Economy, Department of Climate Change, Energy, and the Environment and Water for the Government of Australia. Kate is also the co-chair of the Ad Hoc Intersessional Open-Ended Expert Group on Finance, or Expert Group 1. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kate.
Thanks very much, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to join you for this session. So we'll move straight through to the next slide, please. We can probably skip through to the next one too. What I wanted to do was just very briefly recap some of the key themes that have come through in the discussions, initially through Contact Group 2 discussions at INC2, INC3 and INC4, and then move on to a little bit of a summary of the discussions during the intersessional period post INC4. So, of course, we've been across all of the different elements and provisions of the draft treaty text, diving into discussions at each of the INCs. And the key themes that we heard raised during those earlier INC discussions at INC2 and INC3 in particular are effectively summarised here on the screen. So what we heard fairly consistently across the board was a new instrument to address and tackle plastic pollution will require an effective financial mechanism. Addressing plastic pollution will require significant financial investment, as Michael has just alluded to. And generally speaking, there's been good support and certainly a lot of views from different member states that we should be considering and looking at all sources, public and private, considering in-country, international contributions, and also looking at sort of hybrid and other innovative financing sources. There have been calls for funding to be adequate, accessible, timely and predictable, and to assist parties to meet their obligations under the instrument. It's been interesting to reflect on how that discussion has changed over the period of negotiations. INC2, we discussed in quite some detail the notion of national plans, and spoke about a financing mechanism being available to support parties to meet their reporting obligations largely. That has evolved, of course, as we've gotten into more detailed conversations about what we may need a financial mechanism to do in order to allow us to meet the objectives of the instrument. There's also been some pretty consistent themes about the transparency of a financial mechanism, and that it does need to be directed and sort of dedicated to address specific issues and objectives of the instrument and targeted to areas of greatest need. So we might move through to the next slide, please. So at the conclusion of INC4, of course, we had a very large volume of options in the compilation text, so the treaty text, and this reflected pretty comprehensively the views of different member states, different members of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. And one of the key outcomes from INC4 was the establishment of this ad hoc intersessional expert working groups. Expert Group 1 was charged with developing an analysis of potential sources and means that could be mobilised for implementation of the objectives of the instrument, including options for the establishment of a financial mechanism, alignment of financial flows and catalysing finance. So with that mandate, my co-chair and I, Oliver Boachi from Ghana, in planning the way that we wanted to approach this intersessional work, we're very keen to make sure that the intersessional discussions, both the virtual online meetings and the face-to-face meeting that was held in Bangkok, were designed for sort of robust interactive discussion and knowledge sharing. Our objective really was to make sure that we were supporting members of the expert group to come away with a shared understanding of the different issues and options. Over the course of the intersessional work, the expert group discussed the current evidence available to us and some of the limitations of that current evidence. We heard expert views from all members. We discussed terminology and what that may mean, how it's being used in different contexts. And we spoke to a lot of different examples and precedents. And we heard from a number of different members of the expert group, examples from within their own jurisdiction or illustrations of precedent that have been used in other multilateral contexts. We also had, and we were very fortunate to have the benefit of insights from technical resource persons during that intersessional work, one of whom is joining us in today's webinar, Peggy Lafort. So we look forward to hearing more from Peggy about some of the concepts and issues that were raised and discussed during the meeting in Bangkok. In summary, the outcomes from the intersessional work have been now released in our co-chair's report, and they're presented here on screen. So the report, which I won't go into a huge amount of detail, I hope that you are all aware that it's been now made available on the INC5 webpage. But you can look through that and actually get a sense of both the summaries from the discussion during the intersessional work and some subsequent sort of factual analysis and information that we were able to compile in response to questions from members of the expert group. That presents different examples of the sources of financing across the board that may be available. It provides some descriptions and examples of innovative financing. So, of course, there are many different forms this takes, some which are currently being used specifically to tackle plastic pollution, other sorts of innovative financing instruments that have been used for example, achieving outcomes under other multilateral agreements or in other international financing contexts that we think might be able to be adapted and used effectively to tackle plastic pollution problems. The report also provides in an annex information about precedent of other financial instruments, other financial mechanisms specifically, how they've been designed under multilateral environmental agreements and what those agreements were aiming to do, their objectives, and how the financial mechanism has been designed in those instances to help to achieve the objectives of the instrument. And we have provided, based on the discussions of the expert group, an analysis of the pros and cons of some of the different architectural considerations when we talk about potentially having a fund or funds established within a financial mechanism. My next slide, please. Some of the key observations I wanted to share with you is that from that intersessional work and from the discussions in the INC context so far, I think we are actually reaching areas of strong convergence on a number of fronts. We know that across the board, members generally support the notion that any financial mechanism and any use of funds within a financial mechanism really do need to be directed and guided by the governing body of this instrument. So there is a desire for a financial mechanism to be directly targeting the outcomes of this instrument and accountable to the instrument's governing body. We heard a preference for programmatic funding as well as, or not as well as project-based financing. And because the programmatic funding was, described as being a vehicle for members to look at ongoing, more sustainable requirements and think about what is required over a period of time, rather than basing applications for funding or finance solely on a specific project. We also have heard about the benefits of dedicated resources for capacity building, and so there's strong alignment on calls for a financial mechanism to provide that support. And of course, for any mechanism to be administratively efficient, to minimise overheads and make sure that as much funding as possible is available to achieve the substantive outcomes of the instrument. And a desire for there to be balanced representation, making sure that there's representation not only from donor and contributor countries and organisations, but also from recipients. Next slide, please. Thanks. This is one of the illustrations that's in the co-chair's report, and I won't speak through it in detail. I think that Peggy might be coming back to this in the session. But what we have tried to illustrate in this conceptual diagram is really just something to provide clarity to members of the INC around these different terms. So we have a broad financial landscape that sits outside of all of the bubbles you see on the screen. There are already movements of money between different projects, between different established funds, banks, different institutions for different projects. that existing financial landscape we have to take into account when we're talking about establishing a financial mechanism to achieve the outcomes of this instrument. If we establish a financial mechanism, that's the large blue circle in the middle there, we've also tried to illustrate that a financial mechanism is not the same as a fund, and we can separate out those concepts. There is an option open to the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to establish a new fund or new funds. There's an option open to the INC to consider use of existing funds, perhaps a combination of those things. So there is a lot of flexibility, and we hoped that by including a bit of this sort of conceptual mapping, it would help us to align thinking and all speak, consistently in the final session of negotiations. I might move on now to my final slide. So what I wanted to draw out here is in terms of next steps and what we can expect at INC 5. I think the key questions that we really need to tackle on a financial mechanism are, in order to meet the objectives of the instrument and for it to be successful, what activities will we need to undertake, and by which actors? Who needs to undertake those activities? What financial resources are required to support those activities? That's contingent, and it is obviously closely related to the negotiations that will occur on other provisions proposed in the treaty. Once we have a clear sense of those, I think this will enable us to move more swiftly to finalise our discussions around the purpose and scope of a financial mechanism, to settle views on appropriate architecture of funds, if we're going to establish a new fund or use existing funds or a combination of those things. Of course, there are genuinely pros and cons for each option. And it will allow us to also look into and help to define those questions around the sources of financing, and not only what goes into the funds that might be established for the purpose of implementing the treaty, but what other sources outside the financial mechanism could be mobilised to help us to achieve our ultimate objectives, and how any funds that we are setting aside in this process can be allocated. But yeah, thanks again. I look forward to hearing the rest of the discussions and listening through the rest of the webinar. Thank you, Michael.
Excellent. Kate, thank you so much for that. Super informative. With that, I'm going to pass us to Christian Kaufos, who's the Head of Community Engagement and Impact Resource Circularity for Global Plastic Action Partnership for the World Economic Forum. And Christian's going to give us a brief recap of the first two webinars. So Christian, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michael, and also for the introduction, Kate, to the process. It's great to be with everyone and welcome everyone to the webinar. I also want to thank the partners of the Financing Coordination Group to really, for us to collectively provide these types of conversations, and really in the spirit of also what Kate just talked about, the broader landscape, which includes the financial mechanism, but looks at how we are able to mobilize those required financing flows for really achieving the very ambitious objectives of the instrument in the making. I will try my best in a few minutes to summarize some of the key insights, takeaways, and thematic buckets we discussed in the first two webinars in April and then in July. And we started, I think, early on to really draw a picture of that big landscape, that broad landscape, and setting out the magnitude of the challenge in terms of, plastic consumption predicted to triple by 2060, with 153 million tons of plastic waste expected to be mismanaged, and therefore this huge financial requirement broadly in the financing landscape to bring about a transformation, both leveraging public finance, but also primarily private sector investment, given the magnitude and the ambition of a broader systems change towards circularity. And so maybe moving to the next slide, and Michael touched on this as well. It's not just the magnitude of the challenge and the opportunity here, but also the imbalances and gaps in the current financing landscape, both in relation to, as Michael mentioned, the geographical imbalances with a very low percentage going into emerging markets for investments needed, but also imbalances in terms of where we invest in the life cycle, with, of course, currently most investments going downstream into waste management and very few resources, for example, only 4% going into reuse and refill models. So how do we think about financing in terms of addressing those imbalances and gaps? So we started sort of drawing that bigger landscape, but moving to the next slide, I'll try to do justice to sort of the richness of the two webinars by maybe just touching on a few buckets of topics that were discussed. The first has to do with, we heard a lot in the webinars about learnings from previous multilateral environmental agreements and financial mechanisms. We heard about the Stockholm Convention, a lot actually about the Montreal Protocol and some of the best practices and key insights that we should take on board from those experiences for the purposes of this instrument, whether that's predictable and stable grant funding, engagement and accountability from all donors and recipient countries, and a robust governance structure and strong partnerships within the governance bodies, and other elements. But that said, I think there was also recognition that the scope and the ambition of the plastics instrument we're talking about now is much broader. It's more than just eliminating certain substances and needing capacity building for very specific actions towards it's a much broader systems change ambition with transformation of production and consumption and innovation, new business models, the development of alternatives. And therefore, the large financing requirements are not surprising given that ambition, but we also need to think much bolder and more innovative about the financing mechanism and the broader landscape and how we mobilize financing. So those were some of the thematics up front. We did have a deep dive into the financial mechanism, also towards INC or after INC4, when that became a main focus also as part of the intersessional work. And first of all, what are the requirements, the needs, the financial support needs from the mechanism in general, whether that's implementation, a clearinghouse function, covering and supporting compliance cost, and unlocking additional resources. But maybe moving to the next slide. Also, what Kate already touched on, the pros and cons and trade-offs between different financial mechanism options, and we heard from the Jeff and the World Bank and others on those different options during the webinars. The broader landscaping piece really around the private sector investment was a big focus. We heard from financial institutions, innovators on blended finance, on outcome-based finance options. The example of the World Bank plastic waste reduction linked loan that we'll hear about more today as well, but also design funding, blended finance, and how to link that to the public and ODA monies as well that will be available. And finally, I think a big topic area has been throughout the specific challenges of developing countries and the need for focus and support on regulatory and policy development, financial and technical support, helping with tracking and monitoring methodologies, and support for informal sector, SMEs, startups, specifically in those regions, and providing the right economic incentives. And we heard from Ghana, Indonesia, and other governments during the webinars as well. So hard to do justice to the richness, but I'll stop there and hand back to you, Michael, for next steps. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian. So with that, I'm going to pass the webinar over to Peggy Lefort, who's the Pollution and Circular Economy Lead for UNEP FI. And Peggy will give us a brief recap of the discussions at the open-ended expert group on finance, the meetings that took place in Bangkok in August. So Peggy, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'm delighted to be here today to say a few words on what was discussed in the ad hoc intersessional open-ended expert group 1 meetings in Bangkok in August. And I will more specifically focus on the subject of our webinar today, so aligning and catalyzing finance to end plastic pollution. So the discussions in Bangkok opened with an overview of the magnitude of the problem to address and the scale of the financing requirements to end plastic pollution, and showed that investments required in the end of life stage in collection, sorting, and waste management will need to increase significantly, but are much lower than the investments needed upstream at production stage and at conversion, elimination, and reuse stage. And discussions highlighted the need to reduce investments in harmful activities and to increase investments that would be needed for substitute material production and secondary recycled content production, as well as for collection recycling. The discussions also highlighted, and that was mentioned already by previous speakers, that it is financial resources from all sources that will need to be mobilized, from public source and also from private source, with 90% of resources to be mobilized, which will come from private source, especially in upstream activities. And so there's a need to both redirect financial flows and investments away from harmful activities towards activities that will contribute to end plastic pollution. And that is what is generally understood as aligning, and also to mobilize new and additional resources. And that is what is generally understood as catalyzing. So two concepts which are very complementary of aligning and catalyzing finance. On the concept of the concept of aligning financial flows, as it was discussed in the intersessional meeting, and as it is summarized in the co-chair's report recently published that Kate mentioned, it refers to ensuring that public and private financial flows are deployed as far as possible in line with the instrument's objectives. And so it corresponds to the alignment of financial flows from all sources with the objectives and targets of the instrument by reorienting them from one type of investment to another. And it's a concept which is present in other multilateral environmental agreements, such as in the Paris Agreement in Article 2.1c, in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in Goal D, and in Target 14, and also, for instance, in the Global Framework on Chemicals in Target E3. And this inclusion of the concept of alignment in these multilateral environmental agreements send a strong signal to all parties and to finance actors on the imperative to reorient financial flows from all sources. So that was discussed in Bangkok, and what was also discussed was how to align financial flows. And it's a whole range of measures that are needed to align financial flows with the objectives of the future instrument in order to create an enabling environment and a harmonized enabling environment. And so that can include, for instance, information instruments that reduce uncertainty and improve transparency, operation of risks into investment assessments. So that is, for instance, taxonomies, which are an essential step for shared and scientific definitions of what constitutes sustainable economic activities across the plastics value chain. such as also due diligence requirements, or also robust and harmonized disclosure frameworks related to plastics risks, impacts, and dependencies. It also includes prudential regulations and the integration of plastic pollution related risks into financial regulations, and instruments that internalize the costs of plastic pollution, for instance, taxation or fee. So those were a few examples of the policy instruments and different types of instruments discussed in Bangkok that can foster alignment of financial flows. And on catalyzing financial flows, what was discussed in Bangkok was this concept, which corresponds to the mobilization of new additional financial resources towards the implementation of the instrument's objectives. And it's also a concept that exists in other multilateral environment agreements, and which, for instance, is explicitly mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework in Target 19, and in the Global Framework on Chemicals in Target E3. And this concept requires financing interventions which aim to make solutions across the value chain more appealing to investors, and more appealing to investors by reducing or mitigating risks linked to innovative solutions or business models, like technical risks, like regulatory risks, like market risk, or sovereign risks. And that can be, for instance, through streamlined licensing processes or guaranteed prices. It can be also by transferring risks through financial instruments and blended finance structures. And during the discussions, a number of examples of innovative solutions and blended finance schemes and mechanisms were shared by experts from various member states. And it can also be by rewarding risk-taking in solutions, or on the contrary, penalizing risk-taking in harmful activities instruments through, for instance, rates, green incentives, tax penalties, or fees. So maybe in conclusion, just a few points to highlight that the discussions in Bangkok on these two concepts of aligning and catalyzing finance highlighted that these will require to put in place the enabling environment that has been mentioned a lot during the. It will also require to put in place innovative financing solutions, so blended finance schemes, for instance, EPR mechanisms as well, and that was discussed at length. So EPR mechanisms which require plastic producers and importers to take responsibility for their products throughout their life cycle, from production to disposal and recovery, and whose proceeds can be used to support investment in end-of-life solutions, but also more upstream solutions, such as at the design phase. And also, what I would like to mention from the discussions in Bangkok is that the growth of sustainable finance offers a platform for introducing plastic pollution as a thematic expansion on a global scale. And for instance, there are in the sustainable finance market, which has reached more than $30 trillion in 2022. There are really innovative types of bonds, like blue bonds, which still represent a small fraction of the overall green, social, sustainability and sustainability-linked bonds markets. It represents 0.2%, but it has showed a strong increase, and that has been favored by improved standardization through, for instance, common guidance on blue bonds. So there's still room for more growth of this type of innovative solutions. And what we see also is that most of sustainable finance funds are concentrated in high to middle income countries, which highlights the need for broader geographic expansion in sustainable finance. So last 2 points are that alignment and catalyzing of finance will need to be made, taking into account imbalances between regions that Christian mentioned in his presentation, and taking into account country-specific circumstances. And it's also in the entire finance ecosystem that financial flows and investment will need to be aligned and catalyzed. So that that can be both through a financial mechanism and alongside a financial mechanism, and that has been shown by Kate in the conceptual illustration included in the co-chair's report, and which shows that the financial mechanism can contribute to create the enabling environment, and which also shows how financial flows alongside the financial mechanism will need to be mobilized and aligned with the objectives of the future instrument to end plastic pollution. So Michael, I'll stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion of today. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Peggy. As a reminder, the Q&A line is open. We've gotten some great questions on there already, so please feel free to insert your questions there as we roll into the panel discussion portion of this event. So I'm going to introduce Sophia Salni, who's the special advisor to the Honorable Karen James, the Minister of Climate Resilience, Environment and Renewable Energy for Grenada. Sophia is also the INC focal point for Grenada. So Sophia, I'm going to let you kick this off and manage this piece of the webinar. So over to you, please. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the almost 200 plus participants for joining us today. I'm quite excited to moderate this panel discussion as part of a timely and informative series convened by the Circulate Initiative and their members alongside the INC negotiation process. As shared, as a special advisor to my government, I've led the plastics treaty negotiation process, working closely with colleagues from Global Small Islands and the group of Latin American and Caribbean states within our regional grouping, giving our shared experiences. Thus, I too am very keen to better understand the opportunities to align and catalyze financial flows to meet needs-based financing as part of key considerations to be made within our work at the INC. As Kate has just shared, we've had a very valuable session in Bangkok with good expert group views, as well as technical resource expert inputs being expressed with examples and illustrations presented for consideration for the INC as part of an output report. We also had very good views expressed in prior webinars on financing, as we've heard from Christian, where we're able to better understand the current landscape to consider how we can advance much needed transformation using the opportunity of the INC process. Peggy has just shared specific examples of elements that were discussed within the Bangkok expert session, pointing to the importance of increasing investments away from harmful activities and towards more impactful and innovative solutions, such as circular solutions and solutions across the life cycle of plastics, where leveraging both public and private finance simultaneously is integral to closing the financing gap. The Bangkok session definitely highlighted the importance of aligning and catalyzing financial flows, looking at new and innovative financing from all sources to support a financial mechanism that is impactful. So colleagues, we have a fantastic panel of experts with us today, and I'm quite keen to get started. To help me do this, I'd like to first welcome Erin Simon. Erin is the Vice President and Head of Plastic Waste and Business at the World Wildlife Fund. In her role, she drives positive change across industries in packaging and material sustainability, including spearheading WWF's initiatives, No Plastic in Nature, and leading the development of thought leadership and programs to transform the way the world, and specifically business, fights the plastic waste crisis. Erin, given your very focused mission with WWF to transform the industry approach to plastic waste management, and considering the status of the INC negotiations, particularly the elements highlighted by the INC to be considered within a financial architecture that would support the implementation of the resulting international legally binding instrument. Based on your experience, what are the financial interventions needed to transition economy away from plastic pollution and towards a more circular economy for plastics? How can this be achieved by aligning financial flows with a safe and more circular plastics economy? Over to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the kind introduction and including me on this panel. As we come up on what we hope could be the eve of the treaty, we're well aware, and we've heard from the speakers already, that the implementation aspect of it will be hard and expensive, and not all countries feel quite as prepared as they could be. And we know that the problem we're trying to solve is not actually equitable, right? So to get it right, we need to have countries that have smaller economies. We need to help them get the confidence, right, to ratify and do so knowing that they will have the support, both financially and from an expertise perspective, to implement. We need to, of course, align sustainable development and our approach for that to the global treaties requirements so that we can ultimately maximize the impact of that treaty financing. And we need to make sure we have in-country capacity to really deliver at the pace on the momentous task ahead and report back on progress. But I think if we are successful in preventing leakage of plastic into the environment, we have to really make sure the price of materials and products placed on the market reflect the life cycle cost of preventing, reducing, and of course, controlling plastic pollution in the marine and other environments. And there are ways to do this without infringing upon national tax sovereignty. The recently developed global rules on a minimum effective corporate tax rate has showed us how, right? This is not by really creating a global tax leviathan, but by ensuring that there is a minimum national threshold below which no country will go. And I think this is how you can really generate the funds and incorporate externality costs without distorting the market. I guess imagine if every country producing more than 10 tons of plastic were required to impose an effective fee of like 10% of the market value of raw materials. And imagine if half of that money then was channeled into a global fund for the prevention and mitigation of plastic pollution around the world. I think such a setup could very quickly become the new gold standard, possibly, for international pollution governance, and it could easily be replicated to cover other materials. And also the real beauty of it is it would benefit producer countries as well as consumer countries, which is very rare, but you know, everybody wins. And I think that this is already how governments are working at the national level, right? So why shouldn't we do the same at the global level? And when in our lifetime will we ever have a better opportunity? This treaty specifically aimed at addressing a transboundary pollution problem. So if it's not the time for operationalizing such a, I hate to call it, but a polluter pays principle, I don't know when else it is.
Erin, thank you so much. I think you said quite a lot in such a short space. And I know we have a lot of great panelists that can give some additional views on it, but I just like to say, I do like this idea of trying to understand what a life cycle cost is. And, you know, I think what we're seeing in this process and sort of a lot of the political calls that we're hearing coming out of different processes is for us to consider, you know, how can we leverage the global sphere more impactfully to deliver on closing the financing gap. There's a lot of existing funds that are currently suffering from not being capitalized. There's a struggle to try to identify where that additional source of financing can come from. And we're seeing lots of great examples coming out now on the importance and the impact of innovative financing. And as you rightly said, we have this great opportunity within the INC process to maybe capture some of these new ideas, you know, where we look outside of the box to really try to think of how we can close the financing gap outside of traditional means. And so with that said, I'd like to now bring Dana into the conversation. Dana Masora is the founder and managing director of the Asasi Foundation. She holds a chemical engineering degree and MBA in marketing. Her professional experience ranges from applied research in cosmetics to consumer marketing in Colgate, Palmolive, and Sara Lee in the US and Europe, and plastic packaging value chain in Europe and Africa. She's dedicated to driving the circular economy for plastic packaging, yay, and helping entrepreneurial women from underprivileged communities start social enterprises in recycling plastic packaging and deviating it away from urban and marine littering. Dana, given your experience and background on the implementation of circular economy for plastic packaging and working with social enterprises, as we consider the structure of the financial architecture that's needed to advance the ambitious and binding plastics treaty, I wonder if you can share with us today what considerations on financing must be considered during this transition due to the unique circumstances and the resulting diversity in financing needs across different countries. Over to you, Dana.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really humbled by the opportunity to be part of this panel and share my experience and thoughts on this. You know, when I think about the financing which is necessary for the implementation of the legally binding treaty, I'm really amazed by the level of investment necessary. $1 trillion per year was mentioned. That's humongous, and it means that it's only with the intervention of global financial institutions that this can happen. That the question is, how can global financial institutions make sure that the money are invested at the local level in different countries with very different conditions in a way in which is impactful and really money are doing what they are meant to do. To me, you know, practically, because I am a practical person, I can't think conceptually without a link to the reality in the field. I think that what's very important is that the financing in whatever mechanism, it's linked to the outcome with the impact which needs to be created. And this has to be measurable with very clear KPIs. So whoever gets access to financing has to be committed and hold accountable for the KPIs which will measure the impact once the money are received and used. The other thing, because I can't stop myself thinking from the perspective of a country in Africa, so a continent where there is very high volatility of markets, where the way global crises, like we have at least 2 big ones going on right now, are felt at the first degree in big way. You know, we're experiencing the kind of inflation which makes you dizzy when you have to manage your cash flow. So it means, and really, this is what we're experiencing today. Initiatives need flexibility in the funds which are being brought to them, such as they can stick, and it's our case as well, stick to the deliverables which have to be demonstrated as a proof that the outcome is being realized, meeting the KPIs which bind you to the responsibility for the funding you receive. But you need the flexibility to adapt to unpredictable market turns, unpredictable turns of the contest, such as you can stay viable and still deliver the impact you have to deliver. So this flexibility of the way the funds are being given, the being them bonds, it's our case, but any other mechanism which is provided, the flexibility which aligns to the context of the geography of the country, of the region, it's very important. And then obviously the other question which it's really keeping me thinking is, okay, you give flexibility, you make people accountable, but how do you make sure that the money are doing what they have to do. And again, gets back to accountability. So we really have to make sure that if such a huge amount of money are being put to the service of the implementation of the treaty, then those who get access to money are made accountable for the results in a very clear way.
Dana, thanks so much. And I really love your focus on trying to build in accountability into systems of financing. I know the previous webinar looked at outcomes-based, the potential of outcome-based financing as a tool for inclusion. So it's great that you're sort of bringing in that context that's needed to support its integration. I too am a very practical person. And I think coming from a small island, we try to, as much as we can, bring in our practical realities into the discussion when we consider the priorities that we'd like captured within the treaty process. So it's really important as we think about how financing can work, that we understand the implications of its application at the local level, ensuring that those that are involved in the implementation of solutions have the access and have the right environment to support implementation activities. Thank you so much, Dana. I'd like to now continue on in our panel. Our next panelist that I'd like to introduce is Sonia Batik. Sonia is the Global Head of Carbon Offsets Trading at Citi. She has 20 years of trading experience across equities and commodities derivatives within banks and trading houses. During her career, she has gained great expertise in other commodities via trading of precious metals, base metals, agriculture commodities. Sonia, your experience is very specific. And considering the work that you're involved in and the objective of the Plastics Treaty Instrument, which is to end global plastic pollution within the marine environment, can you share with us today what are some of the current challenges that limit financing toward projects that reduce plastic waste?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and lovely meeting everyone, and thank you so much for having me to this panel. So obviously, as has been mentioned today and in the previous session, plastic waste is obviously a global problem, but we all recognize that it's greatest in emerging nations because this is where there is a lack of managing infrastructure of the waste and they don't necessarily have access to the funding necessary to build all the necessary collection and recycling capacity, because the collection is also a huge issue that is difficult to address and especially on the emerging nation. Actually, according to UNDP, scientists have estimated that only around 9% of all the plastic waste generated globally are recycling. And basically, that's why we are all here today, and we recognize that the amount of money that we need to be generated to make the world completely circular is enormous. And as Michael has mentioned, Christian, Dana, everyone are agreed to recognize that actually the emerging economic only receives 6% of financial flow. And it's a huge imbalance because they are the ones that actually need it. But why is it done? What actually is the issue? Why we cannot channel this money to these emerging economics that are the most in need of funding is because most of the investor will recognize the investment will be perceived as high risk, ultra high risk for the investor because of the economic environment. Often these projects are very early stage. There is a most often fragile economic, and they will require a very high interest rate in return of any such very high risk in investment. And so that's really one of the issues. How can we find a way to channel financing to this potentially high risk project. I mean, perceived as high risk. I mean, we've seen with Assassi it was working perfectly, but how you scale it, how you can get more money to scale it, because the infrastructure can be scaled. And so basically, the idea is to find a way to actually fund and maintain the different activity. And here we're trying to find a finance-based way for projects that are not necessarily economically viable, or they are not, we cannot finance in normal situation, but they are needed, but in top of that, they're most often very rich in environmental and social impact. And that's why the plastic actually credit that has been created, there is different standards that have created a plastic credit mechanism, is actually not the only way. Obviously, we will need so many different ways to fund, but it could be one of the ways to help to provide a financing gap for the projects that are in need of financing.
Sonia, thank you so much. I think this point that you've made on sort of the riskiness of the investments and the potential of leveraging other financing to de-risk some of these investments is really important. And I think it very much aligns with some of the conversations that we had in the expert group session and in other platforms, not just the INC platform, on the opportunity of using existing public financing to de-risk private investments to support some of these innovative approaches to implementation and solutions. I also think it's the point that you made on the importance of scaling and finding opportunities to scale some of the solutions on the ground is really important. We've seen in other instances where for those social enterprises that maybe are not seen as viable, that public financing is being brought in through donors to support micro, small, and medium enterprises and help them sort of build their capacity to become much more viable. I'd like to now call on Christian. We've heard from Christian. He's giving a recap of the first two webinars, and he's joining our panel. Christian is the head of community engagement and impact for resource circularity for the Global Plastic Action Partnership within the World Economic Forum. He's been with WEF for 7 years, managing a diversity of partner accounts and multi-stakeholder projects promoting sustainable consumption. From 2018 to 2020, he incubated and led the Consumers Beyond Waste project, focused on reusable packaging solutions. Christian, we're really happy you're able to join the panel. I know there's quite a lot of context and knowledge you're able to bring to the discussion. I'd like to ask two questions, but I'll first start off with asking you to share with us, what does the alignment of financial flows mean in the context of this ILBI on plastic pollution? And then the second question, I'd like you to sort of address financial interventions needed to transition any economy away from plastic pollution to a more circular economy for plastics, and how that can be achieved through the alignment of financial flows. Over to you, Christian.
Well, thanks a lot, Safia, and also thanks for having me on the panel. I want to echo a lot of the comments that Sonia, Dana, and Karen made around also this idea of the full life cycle cost. And when we think about the full life cycle of plastics, but also the broader plastics economy, it's not surprising that the numbers are so big in terms of the resources we need to address the challenge, because it's really, when you're talking about billions and trillions of dollars and where they come from, it's actually about all the flows that are happening within the waste management sector, the consumer industry sector, the petrochemical sector, and the retail sector, and the distribution and transport, and I'm missing. So it's not surprising that these are huge economies. It's an economy of economies that is linked to the plastics challenge, but also to the plastics pollution solution space, right? So And it goes beyond the plastics industry, because when we think about elimination and reuse or alternative materials, we're also thinking about investment needs and opportunities beyond the plastics industry. So coming back maybe to the very beginning of that nice visual that Kate showed about the flows, it's precisely the flows within and out of the financial mechanism, but then in the whole economic space beyond that, in the world, right? Given also then the balances between developed and developing countries, and the gaps that we talked about here as well, but also the imbalances in sort of downstream versus upstream. Now, when we're talking about alignment of flows, and coming back to your question, I think it's how do we align all of these flows in a way, because ultimately there's that huge question, how do we raise money and channel money, redistribute resources towards where it's needed most, and that is one very key piece. But then it's also how do we embed in everyday investment decisions by the financial industry, but also the corporates, the big ones, the small ones, the coffee shops, the retailers that make daily decisions on how they build out infrastructure, how they develop and evolve their business model, and ultimately how they make money as small, medium, startup or big corporations. And here, I think alignment of financial flows in the context of the treaty, it's really this unique historic opportunity to set as a direction of travel for the market, right? And for the operators in the market to make those investment decisions in a way that it takes investments out of areas that are harmful and into areas that are beneficial and circular. And maybe just to unpack that in sort of 3-4 buckets. One is alignment of financial flows here means in some cases not having conflicting or incoherent flows, right? Subsidizing fossil fuels on the other hand, and then subsidizing and pouring money into a reuse system when the two are not coherent, right? So at the very basic level, it's deconflicting maybe some of the flows. But then when it comes to sort of flows going into sustainable solutions, into innovative circular solutions, I think aligning financial flows means adding up the dollars to make solutions affordable and accessible. That can be, for example, subsidies or tax break on alternatives or on reuse systems that put public money in addition to innovators' money and corporate money that invest in those alternatives so that it becomes affordable and accessible. So that's one dimension. The second is the synergy effects, that $1 plus $1, taking this again as an example, is not $2, it's actually more, because 1 plus 1 is more than 2, because you're starting to create systems, right? If I, as a coffee shop, invest in reusable cups, that investment is worth much more if someone else, the city government, for example, invests in the collection system, right? So I think 1 plus 1 is more than 2 because we're building the system, and aligning financial flows creates those synergies. And what has been mentioned too, finally, is the de-risking aspect, because if we align financial flows, my investment as a single operator or even a single industry becomes less risky because others are jumping on the bandwagon. And so the treaty, how does the treaty or the instrument help in this context? It can set targets, it can set standards and definitions, data and transparency that the markets need to make those decisions. It can put down minimum requirements or recommendations on deconflicting those policies and creating the right policy enabling environment. And in some cases, those provisions will have to be global to provide clarity and predictability to industry, and in others, it will have to be much more national driven or implemented. And of course, that's part of the negotiations. But ultimately, the market needs those rules. And as Erin said, it's a historic opportunity now to set that framework within which then the market operators can unleash these trillions, but again, it's not a scary figure in the sense that it's the economy that needs to shift. And I talked more about that piece now, but I don't want to detract from the importance of what others have also talked about in terms of the fund and the public ODA multilateral piece, which of course is a huge piece in terms of redistribution, but also in terms of catalytic and de-risking for that private sector piece. So just some thoughts from my side. Thank you.
Christian, thanks so much. I think you gave some really great and wonderful examples for consideration. I like the three buckets that you've presented. I'm not going to repeat them. I think you did such a great job in articulating them. But I think really the point is, it's going to be quite expensive for us to implement this agreement. And we have to give consideration to the role of the many industries and economies that you've highlighted. And the treaty really should be well structured to give guidance so that these industries understand how well they can integrate into solution making and supporting solution, whether it's at the global level or whether it's at the national level. I think it's a great segue to my next question to Erin. We've covered this topic quite a bit. But I just, in your opinion, and based on the work that you've done, I wondered, what are the sources in your mind that's already available? And what sources are expected to come on stream for developing countries as additional financing?
Yes, thank you. So achieving the treaty's goal of actually ending plastic pollution will demand that public and private activities and financial flows align with the treaty's core obligations. And this means not only mobilizing and distributing additional financial resources, especially for the implementation in developing countries to reduce that plastic pollution, but also stopping the harmful financial flows that contribute to plastic pollution. So to complement the fiscal package, the treaty should ensure the provision of non-financial resources to enable effective implementation, particularly through that tech transfer, technical assistance, and capacity building, and really sharing best practices, providing training programs, and fostering international cooperation. While that will really maximize the impact of any financial support, while also enhancing the technical and technological capabilities of all countries to collaboratively combat plastic pollution. One of the things we're really trying to do is sort of mobilize the private sector finance for this, but private sector finance really requires a return on investment, right? And so to do that, you have to make sure that those dollars are not just invested in a vacuum, that they are done so in a way where those right enabling conditions are in place. It can't just be project by project. It needs to be into places where they have the right community engaged in it. So government, NGOs, individuals, businesses, you need to have the ability to transition from the current system. So that's sort of upstream. How do you transition out of that? And then how do you make sure you have the right collection, both informal and formal, where needed, into the right infrastructure, whether that's for recycling or reuse, and how do you have the right policies? So that's how we sort of come together and pull those pieces in.
Great, Erin, thanks so much. I've been told we have about 12 minutes to continuing this really fascinating discussion. And so maybe I will just make a shift in the structure that I'd suggested prior. Because Erin, you brought up the role of non-financial mechanisms, particularly we've heard a lot of calls from parties on, how do we support tech transfer to developing countries, particularly those that are able to benefit in such a large way from technology that's often not accessible to them. And with that consideration, I wondered whether I can ask Dana to perhaps respond on how technology transfer, technical assistance, capacity building, and all other non-financial resources can be used and play this complementary role to financial resources. Over to you, Dana.
Yes, and I really love this question because it's one of the things I'm talking a lot, based again on our experience. the way we, in Assassin, became investable and we were able to scale up was because we had the right partners who gave us money in form of grant at that time, because we were still small, but most importantly, gave us access to the expertise which we needed to spend the money right. And this is why if somebody asks me for advice because they have money to give, then my advice is don't give just money. Give also the menu on how to use the money. And when we're talking now about such big amounts which need to be put on the table for the implementation of the treaty, for reaching the objectives of the treaty, really this money have to come together with technical expertise sharing, technology transfer, knowledge sharing from there where it is to there where it's needed. Things like implementing, for instance, EPR in the Global South has to happen by transferring the knowledge from there where it works. Because otherwise we don't have the time to fail. We don't have the time to learn how to do it right. It's much better to take it where it is. In the global north, I'm based in Europe, and there is so much technology and know-how available for the collection, sorting, recycling of plastic. So I'm always knocking at all the doors I can to ask people and experts to come and help me in Africa, in Ghana, because they know how to do things, because they can help me jump steps ahead and not fail and just spend the money right. So I think that's very important to make sure that whatever financial mechanisms are put in place, they include these tools which will motivate the technology transfer, which will motivate the expertise to be shared. Because again, we don't have time to develop all the knowledge there where it lacks. So in this respect, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but at least, that was my occasion to share something which I'm a strong believer in. Money are not enough if they don't come with a know-how on how to spend them.
Thank you, David. I think you were very, very clear, and your response was perfect. I'd like to transition to Sonia. Sonia, I actually have two questions for you. The first is, what are some examples of successful catalyzing of finance from public and private sources you can share with us? And then the second question is, what are the interlinkages between the different sources of finance, public and private, and how can synergies and catalytic effects be achieved so as to develop a multiplier effect for financing?
Thank you very much for these two very good questions. I will try to be fast, but it's kind of a big question and big subject. But let's go for maybe the first one, the innovative solution, because I know Christian mentioned it a little bit before, to talk about the outcome bond. That was one of the innovative solutions that has been put in place. So basically, early I was mentioning that we need to find a way to channel financing from the capital market to this project in emerging market. And one of the burdens is that it's quite high risk. And so how can we find a structure where basically you a little bit de-risk, and that way the project developer don't have to pay an interest rate that is enormous, that they cannot actually afford. And so the plastic credit, as we discussed, is one of the mechanisms to actually help to channel some project, to financing to some project, and then to provide additional financing that is needed just to provide a gap between what's needed and what can be provided. But there is an element fundamental is that when we looked at this type of structure, how we can finance it, we realize as well that there is a big mismatch in timing between the time the funding is necessary to start the project and when actually a plastic credit, is issued. And this timing mismatch is really difficult and it has to be solved. And what we also realize is that the urgent need to mobilize financing from public, private, and voluntary in order to address all these issues today. So the bond essentially, what it's doing is what we design is that it's a capital guarantee, right? So in a normal situation, the investment, so here it was a $100 million will go to, so the issuer was the World Bank, go to the World Bank. And in a normal situation, yearly, the investor will receive some coupon and at the end, they receive the capital back. On this instance, what we did is that the investor will still give 100 million to the World Bank, and this 100 million will not leave. Then the 100 million issuance proceeds will support regular World Bank sustainability development program, so that doesn't change. What is changing is that the coupon of the bond, so we split it in twice to two elements. One is the coupon guarantee, so it's normal as usual, paid yearly. But then we had a non-guarantee coupon, and this coupon actually was $14 million. Will be paid upfront to Citi, that we channel to plastic collectives, that will then channel to two projects. So as I say, in Ghana and another project, Circular in Indonesia. And once a plastic credit and carbon credit, when the dual methodology will be applied, is issued, then basically the investor will receive the coupon. Because Citi will be the off-taker of the carbon credit and plastic collective is the off-taker of the plastic credit. So that's why we call it outcome bond, is that plastic credit and carbon credit issue, yes, they receive coupon. Plastic credit and carbon credit are not issued. The investor will not receive the coupon, they lose the coupon. The coupon is at risk. And here in this structure, so you were asking around, the different integration between public, private, and so here, what's interesting in the structure is that there is different risk appetite that each partner were able to take. And we tried to conceive a structure where we responded to all these risk appetite. So the investor essentially were happy to take the project risk, but not the market risk. So the project risk is that if the project doesn't deliver the plastic credit, they lose the coupon. And if the project function and plastic credit is issued, they receive the coupon. But why they were happy to do that is because the capital was not at risk. The capital was guaranteed. So that's number one. Number two is who is taking the market risk. So for the carbon, which is a very small element, is Citi, and the plastic credit is plastic collective. So regardless of where the market is at the time for such a credit, the payment is fixed. So upfront, we decided the amount that will be fixed by each credit issued. And the board investor will receive the coupon linked to this credit issuance. And essentially, that was helping the two projects, to receive some funding that they will never have access otherwise, because these investors, as much as they were happy, we had quite a few investors that would have loved to invest in this project, but they couldn't because they cannot touch a plastic credit or carbon credit, and they cannot touch directly staff project. But by this structure, because it was a capital guarantee, they were only having part of the coupon at risk for this project. I will enable them to fund this project. And for the project developers, I was helping them to access some financing at an interest rate that was reasonable and not very high, because as we mentioned before, this is a high risk project and potentially country for that this project would be needed. So I've been trying to be fast. Hopefully it's clear. So that was hopefully responding to your two questions.
Great, Sonia. Thanks so much for that fantastic explanation on the structure of how the plastic credit works. I learned quite a lot. Thanks so much for sharing that, and hopefully we can capture that within the output report from this session. So folks, this is the end of our panel. I wish we had an additional hour to keep going. I think it was great, fantastic responses. And I really love learning new material. And so I'd like to thank the Circular Economy Initiative for supporting this webinar, asking me to consider moderation. And I will now hand it over to Michael and thank each and every one of the panelists for your very resourceful and informative interventions. Thank you so much.
Great. And if we can keep the panelists on, and maybe Kate and Peggy, if you're still here for the Q&A, we've gotten a bunch of great questions. And so I'm going to try to go through as many of these as we can in the remaining 10 minutes. So maybe Dana, starting with you, there's a question about the enabling environment in developing countries and how that is needed to really absorb financial flows and kickstart innovation, particularly those countries that may lack a large and dynamic private sector. So we'd love your thoughts about the enabling environment in Ghana, and then maybe Sophia, you could speak to that as well, and anyone else that wants to chime in. So Dana.
Yes, enabling environment in Ghana. Ghana has a government which is quite committed to put in place what's necessary to address the problem at hand, which is the plastic pollution. This translates into things which the local government, so there where a project like ours wants to intervene, it's working with us to help us implement the type of actions which will create an impact. Specific examples like, giving us access to land, either for free or a very good rent, very accessible rent, working with us as a priority on implementing programs in the community engagement, which are meant to change behavior, engaging with waste pickers, created awareness about our type of programs, and encouraging the waste pickers to work with us towards programs which will drive just transition. So if you don't have an enabling government with this type of support, then you can't really, no matter how much financing you have, you can't really make an impact. So I would say that it's very, very important that, again, if money are being put on the table for initiatives, then the government is indeed committed to make it work and to make sure that the impact can be realized.
Excellent.
If I can just jump in here, Michael,
Please.
I'd just like to support Dana's point. At least from our national circumstance in Grenada, we do have support at the very high level. Our Prime Minister has endorsed a number of initiatives to help support plastic waste management. He's identified it as a key item that he'd like to support during his tenure. And in terms of how we have approached creating an enabling environment, we've sort of noticed that we're limited by our capacity. And so part of what we'd like to see out of the plastics treaty process is financing that would allow us to build our local capacity, allow us to have, to create our own access, and allow us to have the type of expertise and keep and retain the type of expertise that's needed to support the implementation of innovative solutions. We've also done quite a bit of work on strengthening our existing legislation and looking to develop additional legislation to align with key priorities captured within the plastics treaty.
Excellent. Another question, and a big one. A question about where will the vast majority of the funds come from? We've heard of things like EPR, and we've got 6 minutes for this question. So I don't know, Kate or Peggy, if you want to share anything, or Aaron. This is a big one. Questions about EPR, public versus private. We know that the number that we need is huge, but would love either Kate, Peggy, or Aaron to chime in on this one, please.
I'm happy to, but I think Erin also had a hand up.
Yeah,
Michael,
yeah,
Erin, do you want to go
yeah.
in jump in first?
Yeah.
No, you're off mute. Why don't you go and then I'll build off of you.
Yeah.
Sure. So I was just going to, I'll be as brief as I can. I was just going to draw reference back to some of the comments that Christian mentioned earlier, because it's not the only point here, but certainly really relevant to bear in mind that a lot of what needs to be done in order to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for will be achievable by shifting practices and changing the way that we spend money that we're currently spending. So there's a lot of money that's flowing around the world, a lot that is being invested in the production of plastics, in the way that things are designed, the way that they're distributed and retailed and consumed and then collected, etc. Which frankly we can do better. We can do more efficiently. We can do in ways that helps to prevent the leakage of plastic into the environment. We can make sure that we're designing plastics that are cleaner and less problematic from a human health and environmental perspective too.
Mhm.
So that's really important. Part of this is about shifting current money that's already out there, that's already being spent. There's definitely a need to better balance the flows. So where there is pollution happening and the polluters are not currently paying a fair share for the pollution that's being caused, that's where we would introduce some of the different mechanisms like taxes, fees, and other charges. Extended producer responsibility is a really good example of this, where we basically, make the person who creates the product responsible for it throughout its lifetime, and often that's through a payment of a fee or a levy of some sort. And we also know that the contributions that are being made by public systems, so by national and subnational and regional governments, there's already a lot of money being paid from the public purse, from tax bases, for the waste collection and infrastructure services, and for a whole lot of related programs and cleanup initiatives. That will continue to happen. It may grow. So we shouldn't dismiss that. That will continue to be a really important contribution here. And, in some cases, there might be additional funding that can then also be mobilized from, so additional contributions from public sources, or it might be that, there's sort of a partnership approach where money that comes from a fund that we create under this treaty, for example, might encourage others, might encourage philanthropic investment, or it might encourage other voluntary contributions from other sources. So they're just a few of the other means and mechanisms.
Great, Aaron?
Yeah, I'll just build on that a little bit, right? Like, when you listed a number of different fund sources, and I think obviously the answer is we need all of them, plus, in addition to what Kate was referring to, it's not just that we need to finance the shift, we need to coordinate that financial shift, right? Successful implementation will require not just dollars, but capacity building and knowledge sharing, and all of those good enabling conditions we've all discussed on today's call. But it's also about a coordination between those different fund sources that we haven't really had before. There's different types of dollars that will benefit different parts of the shift, right? You can imagine the need for these countries to be ready and prepared with those enabling conditions will often take grant dollars or development dollars or dollars that are not going to provide a return on that investment.
Yeah.
But that investment will actually make it attractive for those looking for a return on investment to invest in those countries. And so what it is it's not just about us targeting all of the different financial players, but targeting them in a way that creates a coordinated impact. And I think that's difficult to do today. We're not really great at coordinating all of those different sources. And I think it's going to be really important for us to do that. I think as the work that Michael, you and I and Circulate Capital are trying to think about in the LIVE Collaborative, which is not something that is really public yet, but it's really about creating that coordinating function for investment so that we are in fact incentivizing more dollars with every investment. So
yeah, totally. Great. So there are a couple of questions and comments that reference the critical role that the informal sector plays in the circular economy and in this transition. We have a minute, so we don't really have time to do that topic justice. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to just briefly speak to that. I mean, there's a question of how do you support them? How do you make sure that the funding flows to them to support their livelihoods? And we know that they are the recycling industry in many countries around the world. But I don't know, Dana, if you want to mention something about that. But for me, it's just acknowledging that we have to have that front and center in this funding discussion.
Yeah, and I can say about what we're doing. We're basically working with the waste speakers towards implementing the Social Plus type of program, which is part of the ocean-bound plastic program. But again, there's something which I'm very keen at, which is making sure that we don't give them access to money without making them accountable for the impact, which, we got the money to create an impact. They have to be part of creating the impact with us. So if we put speakers for just transition into the Social Plus program, this is towards reaching the same goals in impact measurable by the KPIs, which we are accountable for.
Great. And there was a question about accountability as well. So I appreciate you kind of weaving that in. And unfortunately, we are at time, and the role of a good moderator is to make sure we try to stay on that. So we didn't get to every question. We will try to address those when we send out the follow-up, but we will send the recording and the slides to everyone that joined the webinar. And I just want to thank all of our panelists and speakers, some of whom are still on very late in their day. So we really appreciate it, and amazing questions, and I learned a ton. So I really appreciate everyone's time and contributions. And thank you for joining us. Thanks, everyone.